I must say, for those that work on the microbiome, it's so difficult to pronounce. You need a nomenclature committee and you need acronyms. I'm sorry. Just do it. Enough already. You're killing us.
We'll call it BC. We'll call it BC.
Thank you. We're going to start the nomenclature committee without you if you don't do it soon.
So they noticed that this went up by like 3 to 4-fold. So I kind of went down the rabbit hole on this. So interestingly, that particular species of bacteria is actually associated with lower adiposity, better insulin sensitivity, and people who are obese and children who are obese tend to have less of it. So I said, well, based on that study, you could actually argue that maybe sucralose actually improved the gut microbiome. Now, again, I'm not making that claim because, we have a hard time understanding what a healthy microbiome looks like already. What this last study that came out, my biggest take home was, I think it's safe to say that some of these non-nutritive sweeteners are not metabolically inert, that there are some effects. Now, are those effects good, bad, or neutral? I think has yet to be fully elucidated. Now, I focused more on the blood glucose responses in my analysis. So in that 10-week study, they looked at, they did oral glucose tolerance tests. And their conclusion, I didn't really feel like fit their data. So their conclusion was that, and I think it was sucralose, that it elevated blood glucose. And this is where statistics can get kind of tricky. So my take home was the area under the curve, the incremental area under the curve, which is looking at basically the entire glucose response, was not different between the control and the sucralose group. To me, that's the biggest take home. There was one time point at the end of the study in the sucralose group, the 30-minute time point, that was statistically significantly higher blood glucose than the control group. It's kind of one of those things where I go, okay, it was one time point, it's statistically significant, but even then, we've seen things be statistically significant that end up being data artifacts because they're not reproduced. So I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but again, the overall area under the curve was not different. So to me, that was the biggest take home.
And papers, we should probably mention, are published because of effects generally. Yeah. Lack of effect, harder to publish.
Null hypothesis doesn't, it's actually really unfortunate because a null hypothesis is just as useful data as the non-null hypothesis, but you're right, there is a very strong publication bias towards showing an effect versus not.
Yeah, unless you can flip a field on its head entirely by showing something did not happen, typically the positive result outdoes the negative result. In positive meaning you see a result. And then of course it's one study. And yes. And I think that as you talked about earlier, the center of mass of data in a given field are probably the best basis for what we should do.
Right.
In terms of, and so I'm not changing my behavior around the intake of artificial sweeteners. I personally am still going to consume stevia and aspartame in relatively small amounts.
Yeah.
But now I'm thinking, well, okay, if something contains sucralose, I don't have to perhaps actively avoid it. Whereas before I was actively avoiding it.
So the new study I thought was very elegantly designed, very involved. I mean, be quite frank, some of the animal stuff they did was extremely impressive. So there was actually 2 arms to this study. One was a human arm, one was the animal arm. I focused much more on the human side of it. So basically this was a 2-week study, and the really unique aspect of this, which I think is both a strength and a weakness, they had almost 1,400 people apply for this study, and they only had 120, I think, that actually went into it because they did a very detailed food analysis of these folks. All these people said that they avoided artificial sweeteners or didn't consume them. And I think people don't realize how ubiquitous sweeteners are.
Prior to the study, these people were like, it was like jury selection. They had never,
yes.
It's like not ever hearing of the plaintiff and the defendant. These are these mutant people who have never had an artificial sweetener.
Right. So the strength is now you don't have a lot of like pre-existing, effects that may be clouding what would actually happen when you add it in. Like, for example, if you have people who are already consuming artificial sweeteners and then you have them consume artificial sweeteners, the likelihood things are going to change is pretty low, right? So I think that that's a strength. it's also a weakness, and I want to be really careful because I think people took my words a little bit too far, which means I probably didn't do a good job of being nuanced enough. There is the possibility for a placebo effect here. So to me, if somebody has gone through that much painstaking care to avoid artificial sweeteners, it's likely they have a preconceived notion that those are bad for you, because they're difficult to avoid. Yes, it's possible if they're eating a very minimally processed diet that they're just not exposed to them, and that's very true as well. The other thing that the researchers acknowledged was they weren't able to blind the study. Because if you've never had an artificial sweetener before, you're only used to like regular sugar, and you have an artificial sweetener, you know.
You taste it.
You know. It's still sweet, but it's not the same sweet.
Yeah, and there's an interesting effect there where a lot of people don't like the taste of aspartame the first time.
Yeah.
I actually quit drinking diet soda for a while, thinking I should, and then had one. It tasted really, I can only describe it as kind of artificial, chemical.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon it tasted great again.
Yep.
And so there is some attenuation there. And whether or not that's central, meaning within the brain, or peripheral, I don't know. But very interesting. Well, I see you as playing a critical role in defining what is and what isn't, what still needs to be determined in terms of this landscape and the entire landscape, really, of nutrition.
And that study did change my opinion in terms of, okay, I think we can clearly say now that like these aren't neutral, or sorry, that they're not inert, right? Like that was the thought process before. It was, well, they're not digested or whatnot, so they must be inert. That doesn't appear to be the case. But again, like when we look at the blood glucose data, and I'm not saying this is what happened. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's possible this happened. And so this is why we need more studies to verify. If these people had a preconceived notion that artificial sweeteners were bad for them, it's possible, knowing they're ingesting artificial sweeteners, that they could have had a blood glucose response. Now, my pushback on my own point there would be, then we should have expected to see it in all the non-nutritive sweeteners, which they didn't. It was just in sucralose and saccharin.
Yeah, it was kind of a graded effect where sucralose and saccharin showed the most dramatic change.
Yep.
And stevia and a few of the others did not.
And the other issue I took with it, maybe it's a ticky-tack thing, was their primary outcome measure was blood glucose, so the oral glucose tolerance test. But they had people administer their own oral glucose tolerance tests, which basically they said, okay, drink this drink, and they were wearing continuous glucose monitors, which should have been fine. But again, to me, and I'm being ticky-tacky, and again, I know all studies are limited by funding, so I think overall this was a great study. But I would have liked to have seen them, monitor the oral glucose tolerance test
and
to administer
it before
it.
Or after. Right? Yeah. You want to know that they didn't ingest this or did ingest that. Yeah.
Those two things. But one other caveat is it was a 2-week study, right? So we got to be really careful how much we interpret in this, because it's also possible that this is a transient effect, right? And maybe it goes away over time. We don't know. But again, I think we can clearly say it's not inert, right? Now, how much emphasis we put on that on a 2-week study, I still will say, okay, maybe if you're worried, don't consume sucralose, right? But if you're, 100 pounds overweight and you want to use some sucralose as a replacement to help you lose weight, I would say don't let this study deter you from doing that, because the net effect is still going to be more positive than you not losing the weight, right? So if it's a tool that helps you, fine. But I do hold open the idea that, well, there could be negative effects from it as well. But again, we're looking at like what is the overall outcome, right? And then when I looked at, they examined like some of the different things that were increased with these different sweeteners. And again, this is where it gets messy, because one of the things they saw was a big increase in butyrate production from the change in the gut microbiome, presumably. Well, as we discussed earlier, butyrate's actually associated with like positive outcomes in terms of insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and some other things. So I want to be real cautious before people say, well, there's a change in the microbiome, it must be a bad change. We don't know. It's possible. And again, if we have, 10 more studies come out and start to show this, then I will start to shift my personal opinion of artificial sweeteners.
So in anticipation of sitting down today, I did solicit for questions on social media. And one of the questions that got a lot of upvotes, likes if you will, was it one that I think raises interesting questions about short-term and long-term health. And it's the following. I think it's a common scenario. A number of people want to know, what is the healthiest way to approach a kind of rapid weight loss? And here what I think is happening is somebody has an event coming up, or they're just tired of being the weight they are, or carrying the amount of adipose tissue they are, and they wanted to know whether or not it is safe to, for instance, lose 3 pounds a week for a few weeks in anticipation of a wedding or some other event, and whether or not straight caloric restriction and increasing activity is the best way to approach that. With the understanding that they may gain back a little afterwards. They might, I think ideally they'd like to maintain it afterwards. But what do you think of that sort of approach? Cutting caloric intake in half, for instance, and then doubling your physical output.
So it's interesting because you might be surprised by what I'm going to say, which is the research data actually tends to suggest that people who are like obese, who lose a lot more weight early, are more likely to keep it off. Which seems a little bit kind of contradictory, right? Like, well, that doesn't seem very sustainable. But again, you're weighing competing things. So there's sustainability aspect, but then there's also like buy-in is huge for sustainability, right? So for a lot of overweight or obese people, if they start a diet and they don't see something quickly, they kind of bail on it because it's not working. Whereas if they see some rapid results pretty quickly, they buy in even harder, right? And so I think the conversation, especially for if there's any coaches or trainers out there, is just presenting that as one of my favorite lines is, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. I think Thomas Sowell said that. So you're having a trade-off here. It is, yes, you're going to lose fat faster. You might lose lean mass a little bit faster too, which can be a problem. But I will say, the more adipose tissue you have, the more aggressively you can diet without negative consequences. Somebody like me doing a really aggressive diet is not going to be good for my lean mass. 1, I have a higher lean mass than normal. 2, I have a lower body fat than normal. As your body fat goes down, the percentage of weight loss from lean mass goes up. So people who are very obese, because they have so much adipose tissue to pull from, there's very little reason for the body to catabolize lean tissue. Now, that being said, if you go on people misinterpret, like they're like, well, I got a in-body done or a DEXA done, and I've lost 2 pounds of lean mass, and they've lost 20 pounds overall. Well, keep in mind, adipose tissue itself is 13% lean mass. So there's actually protein component to like the structural component of the adipose tissue, and it does have some water. So it's about 87% lipid, but the other part is lean. So at minimum, you should expect a 13% reduction in lean mass when you diet. And then when you consider you lose body water overall, which registers as lean mass, and you lose your splanchnic tissues can shrink a little bit. So it's normal to lose, for the average person to lose 25 or 30% of the weight that they lose from lean mass, but that doesn't mean skeletal muscle tissue. And again, the more adipose you have, the more aggressively you can approach the diet without really negative long-term consequences to lean mass or your overall health. But balance that with, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need to understand that I'm not going to be dieting this way forever. I'm doing this to give myself a boost at the beginning, and I have to be okay at some point with transitioning to something that's a little bit more sustainable.
Based on what you just said, it reminds me of the satiety signal effect of exercise you mentioned earlier, that exercising can improve our sense of when we've had enough to eat. I just want to briefly mention that when Ali Crum was on the podcast, she mentioned that they'd been doing a study that I have to pair you to and have hear the conversation as a fly on the wall, because what she was telling me was that if people believe that a food is nutritious for them, then eating less of it registers as more satiating. Whereas if people view dieting as a deprivation system, like, dieting is hard and the food sucks and it's terrible, well, then they crave all sorts of other things. Whereas they actually observe in their studies where people report reduced craving if they are told, for instance, a chicken breast and broccoli and some olive oil and rice is actually quite nourishing. It's actually really good for you.
Yeah.
Then people eat that and they feel like they've actually eaten more. The satiety signaling goes up. So it's just a point that Ali made. Those aren't my data.
Satiety is so impressive because even the rate at which you eat and right down to the size of the plate and the color of the plate, like the contrast in color.
Really?
They see, I can't remember exactly. I think it's if the plate is a similar color to the food, I think people eat more. Whereas if it's a bigger contrast, they eat less. So even like plate color can make a difference on how much you eat. So again, human brain, very amazing, but also very dumb in some ways, right? Like
not an optimized algorithm.
I always joke with people. I'm like, just look at how stupid humans are. You put some water in front of them, like, the ocean. They're like, oh yeah, I'll pay 10 times more for this, but it's just, we're kind of wired that way.
The reward signaling pathways in the brain run one chemical mainly, dopamine. There are others, of course, and very few algorithms. It's sort of like a intermittent reinforcement is one, random reinforcement, but in the end, there aren't many algorithms, and we are probably not optimized, certainly not optimized for our own health, because people will eat themselves to death, drug themselves to death, et cetera, simply because something felt good at one point. Right. It proves your point.
One of the things I tell people, I said this on Andy Frisella's podcast, was interestingly, the dichotomy of life is if you do what's easy in the short term, your life will be hard. If you do what's hard in the short term, your life will get easier. It's very strange. And actually, Ethan Suplee had a great example of this. When he was over 500 pounds, he said, the amount of work I had to do to construct my life that I could just live was so much more work than just going to the gym for a couple hours a day. He's like, the gym work is hard. He's like, but when I look back at how much work I had to do to sustain that lifestyle versus just going to the gym and restricting calories. He's like, to maintain the lifestyle of being 500 pounds was infinitely more difficult than what I do now. And so again, a great example, short-term hard, going to the gym, calorie restriction, long-term, life's easier. Just really interesting dichotomy I think about a lot.
And it probably can't be restated often enough. Seed oils. People want to ask about seed oils, and for those of you that are listening who are wondering why we're sort of chuckling already, I should mention that both in the Twitter sphere and Instagram and online, that there are these very polarized views that probably aren't worth focusing on for too long. But there are a number of folks out there who are arguing that seed oils are the source of all, the obesity epidemic,
everything,
all, inflammation, et cetera.
Illuminati.
Everything. And then there are those that would argue just the opposite, that, meat is the source of all problems, et cetera. And I think thanks to your nuance and expertise, we've hopefully appropriately framed things that it's never that black and white. It's simply not.
Rarely.
I love olive oil. I realize that doesn't fit exactly into the seed oil category. I love olive oil. I use it in moderation. I do also consume some butter in moderation. Et cetera. But are there any data on seed oils? And here, a good example, I think, would be like canola oil, which comes from the rape seed that literally was renamed canola oil because rape seed oil is not good marketing.
No, exactly. So the first thing I'll say is seed oils have negatively contributed to our overall health because people in the last 20, 30 years, what they have tended to add into their diet that has increased the overall calorie load is oil, like these various, mostly from seed oils. But when we look at like one-to-one replacement with other fats, and so if you look at the epidemiology, you can find some epidemiology showing people who consume more seed oil have more negative health outcomes. Problem is, again, tied up with a multitude of other behaviors. And then you can find mechanisms, and the idea is, these have, they're polyunsaturated, which means in the fatty acid chain, there's multiple double bonds, which those double bonds can be oxidized when they're exposed to heat and some other things. And so the idea is, well, when you cook with these things and, they make it oxidized, and that's going to cause inflammation in your body. So that's a plausible mechanism. So as always, I defer to the human randomized control trials. And so what you tend to find is when you substitute polyunsaturated fats, when you substitute saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats, it's either neutral or positive in terms of the effects on inflammation is basically neutral. There's some studies that show a positive effect of doing polyunsaturated fats, but it probably depends on the individual polyunsaturated fat. And that's the other thing I don't really is difficult, because you're categorizing like everything in this one bucket, and there are some differences between individual fatty acids. Even with saturated fat, for example, stearic acid doesn't tend to raise LDL cholesterol, whereas, saturated fat as a whole tends to raise LDL cholesterol, but there are some saturated fats that don't. So again, it's like we're putting things in buckets, and it's a little more nuanced than that. Then if you look at the effects of polyunsaturated fats on markers of cardiovascular disease, again, tends to either be a neutral or positive effect when you substitute saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. Now, if you want to get into monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated, there's quite a bit of disagreement between the studies. What I would say, based on the human randomized control trials, is that you're probably better off consuming monounsaturated and polyunsaturated in place of saturated fat. But again, if the idea is, well, that means polyunsaturated are good for me, so I'm just going to dump a bunch of oil on everything, and now you're upping your calories. Well, that's a negative now, right? Because you have to deal with the bigger problem of overall energy toxicity. So I'm not somebody who likes to demonize individual nutrients. I just haven't seen really compelling evidence that seed oils are the root cause of the problems that are being suggested. And I think this is a good example of kind of whenever there's something that pops up in the fitness industry, there's always the opposite thing that pops up, and it's the reactionary, extreme reaction to whatever this thing was over here. And I think that's what we're seeing with some of the seed oil stuff. Is it's mostly people who are trying to kind of expose the virtues of saturated fat. And listen, I think it's fine to consume some saturated fat, but again, I think limiting it to 7 to 10% of your daily calorie intake is probably wise. Again, based on all the consensus of the evidence I've seen. And so once again, we're struggling with this. Okay, we've got this epidemiology and these mechanisms that sound good, but then what actually happens when we do some human randomized control trials? And so far, I just haven't seen the evidence to suggest that seed oils are independently bad for you, independent of the calories they contain.
You said the words overall energy toxicity, and I just want to highlight that I think that's a fabulous term. I don't think enough people think about that, because they are primed, or we are all primed to think, okay, seed oils might be bad, or artificial sweeteners might be bad, or this particular component of blood work might represent something good or bad, without taking into account overall energy toxicity, the toxicity of over-consuming calories, energy. And thank you for pointing out that most of the data point to the fact that saturated fat should make up about no more than 7 to 10% of total daily caloric intake. Is there a lower end threshold that can be problematic? For instance, I've noticed that my blood profiles, especially in terms of hormones, improve when I'm getting sufficient saturated fat. Maybe I'm a mutant, but years ago, because I'm a product of growing up in the 90s, I tried a low-fat diet. It certainly crushed my androgen levels. I started adding some butter back in, and I was right back in the sweet zone where I wanted to be. So 7 to 10% of totally daily caloric intake I'm guessing is probably about what I do now. I'll have to check. But is there a danger to going too low in saturated fats?
So again, no solutions, only trade-offs, right? What maximizes out testosterone might not be the best thing for longevity, right? And vice versa. Now, I'm not making that claim specifically, but I think it's important to understand this, that I think we all have this idea that there's this one iconic diet out there that is going to be the best diet for building muscle and burning fat and preventing cancer and heart disease. And the reality is, like, there's overall healthy dietary patterns that we see that are good for those things. But when we get down into the weeds, there's probably some push and pull here as well, right? So when it comes to saturated fat, there is some evidence that if you're too low on it, that yes, you can have a reduction in testosterone. Now, is that reduction in testosterone, let's say 15, 20%, whatever it may be, is that sufficient to actually cause loss of lean mass? That we don't know. That's never been shown. Interestingly, I just remembered this. There was one study that was comparing polyunsaturated fat versus saturated fat, and they equated total fat. And one of the really interesting things was the group getting the polyunsaturated fat had more lean mass at the end of the study compared to the group getting saturated fat. Now, it's only one study. I've never seen this replicated. So this is a situation where I say, I would like to find out what the mechanism of that is, because this could just be random. But if that gets shown over and over, what I might say is, okay, well, if polyunsaturated are somehow increasing lean mass compared to saturated fat, who cares what happens with testosterone, unless that reduction in testosterone is causing some kind of impotence for your life, right? So all that to say, I don't really know. And by the way, that's something for those watching and listening, real experts, every once in a while, you should hear them say the following words: I don't know.
Exactly. My